Figuring out your guest list can be tough and sometimes is one of the hardest parts about planning a wedding. But in this week's video, I'm sharing some of my tips to help you decide who makes the cut and who does not. Welcome back to my channel, Hitched Academy. My name is Kimberly Rhodes and I'm a professional wedding planner and have been since 2011. And today I'm back on YouTube sharing some of my best tips and tricks so you can plan your own wedding like a pro. So in last week's video, which I will link below, I was talking about the best ways to save money overall on your wedding, and my biggest tip is to cut the guest list, but that can be tough. So today I'm diving into the different things you should be thinking about as you're putting together your guest list. First, there are 6 different categories I think you should consider when you're putting together your guest list, and that is family, friends, family friends, kids, plus ones, and work colleagues. I'm gonna dive into all 6 of those and give you some opinions on making the best choices in those categories. First up, family. Now, you either have a big family or you don't, and your fiance either has a big family or they don't. And unfortunately, you can't control that. If your parents have a lot of siblings and those siblings have a lot of kids, meaning you have a lot of cousins, your guest list might inherently just be larger, and you just can't control that. However, you can think through how far down that family rabbit hole you want to go. Meaning, are first cousins invited but second cousins are not? Is family you haven't seen in years invited to the wedding or not? Are family members you don't even know invited to the wedding because your parents might know them? These are all things you'll have to think about and discuss with your family in order to come to an agreement on how that family portion of the guest list shakes out. My personal opinion is I don't think it makes a lot of sense to invite family you haven't seen in years or longer, or to have family members that you don't even know or wouldn't recognize if they were in the room with you. However, these can be kind of sensitive subjects because it comes down to family, so just know you're gonna have to have those conversations in order to get to a guest list related to family that you feel good about. I also think thinking through the type of wedding you want to have, like do you want it to be more intimate or do you want it to be a big celebration, can help in determining where that family cut gets made. Next up, friends. Now, I find in my planning business that my younger clients typically have more friends on the guest list than my older clients do. So my early 20s brides and grooms typically have a larger portion of their guest list that are their friends. And my early 30s clients typically have a more defined or narrow friend group. That's just kind of what I see. Regardless of where you fall on that spectrum, I would encourage you to think through your friends section of the guest list and narrow it down to the people you actually spend time with. So while it would be great to invite everyone you're friendly with, I think it's important to only invite people you are friends with, which is different. So think through, like, when was the last time you had a meal with this person? Do you want the next meal you have to be the wedding meal? Like, if you haven't seen this person in years, do you want the next time you see them to be at your wedding? If money is no object, that can change this equation. But for most people, they're having to pull in their guest list just because of budget. And I think it's important to think through who are the people you truly spend time with and then want to spend time with on your wedding day. My husband and I dated for 3 years before we got engaged. And so our rule of thumb for our guest list was if over that period of time, the other person hadn't met that friend, they likely weren't that good of a friend, unless of course they lived out of town or some kind of circumstance like that. But in general, we limited our guest list to friends that the other person also had met before. So just think about that as well. Really narrowing down that list of people that you truly care about and truly want to be there is important. And even though it's hard, once you start to put a dollar sign above everyone's head, it makes it a little bit easier to trim your guest list. The next group is family friends. Now, this would be friends of your parents or work colleagues of your parents, people who are not directly related to you, but associated to your family in some sort of way. And I have to say, this is usually the category that can be pretty tricky. Now, if your parents are paying for your wedding, they obviously should have some say in who they can invite. but that might mean you don't know that person very well. Part of me says you gotta let it go. If you're not paying for it, you gotta let it go. The other part of me says this is a conversation you need to have with your parents on what kind of wedding you want to have, how intimate you want it to be, and who you want to be surrounding you on this important day. Again, difficult conversations sometimes, but they need to be had, especially when there's a financial aspect to who is invited to the wedding. Category number 4 is kids, and this one can be a little tricky as well, but you really do need to draw a line in the sand on if kids are invited to the wedding or if this is an adult-only affair. There's no right or wrong. You have to do what's right for you, and I have a lot to say about this. So next week, my video is going to be the pros and cons of having kids at your wedding, so make sure you subscribe and ring the bell to be notified so that you don't miss that video. In general, there's a lot to go into thinking about kids or not at your wedding. I personally did not have kids at my wedding except for my niece who was an infant, and for my own client weddings there's a lot of debate back and forth, so we'll dive into that next week, so make sure to subscribe. Next up is plus ones. Now, as someone who was one of the last of my friends to get married, I always liked the option of bringing a guest to a wedding. However, when you're on the other side and planning and looking at the financial aspects of it, adding these additional guests can be expensive. So I think you should really think through, A, if everyone who is single gets a plus one, or if you want to put parameters on the people who get an additional guest, which is what I would suggest. So you can make the line again in the sand of the only people who get the plus one are people who are in serious relationships, but if you're just dating whoever, then you don't. I think that also helps because then you won't have a lot of randoms at your wedding. The people who are there are people that you know because they will be the significant others of people on the guest list. So think through that as well. Who gets a plus one and who doesn't? It also could be that the only people who get plus ones are people who wouldn't know anyone else. So if you are inviting, let's say, someone from work and they don't know the rest of your friend group, it would be nice if they could bring a plus one so that they're not by themselves, not knowing anyone else in attendance. But thinking that through in the beginning stages can be really helpful. And lastly, work associates. Now, think about this. If you were to quit your job just before you mailed out your wedding invitations, who would still make the cut? I know that's deep, but truly, who would make the cut if you didn't currently have that job? I think it's good to think through who you're inviting just out of obligation versus who are the people that you really want there. And if you didn't have that job just before the wedding invitations were mailed, who would be invited? If you decide not to invite some of your associates at work to your wedding, or even just a select few to your wedding, I'd highly recommend you limit the amount you talk about your wedding planning process. So if the person you're sitting next to at the office is hearing every single detail about your planning and about the process, chances are they're gonna think that they're invited and might get their feelings hurt when they aren't, yet you're telling them everything there is to know about it. So I'd highly recommend just really thinking about how much detail you're sharing with people who are not invited to the wedding, especially people at work. Like I said, putting together that guest list is hard, but once you start thinking about people as a dollar sign above their head, it makes it a little bit easier to make some cuts. Thanks for joining me here at Hitched Academy. If you found this video to be helpful, give it a thumbs up and leave me a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. And if you're looking for more planning advice, check us out on Instagram at Hitched Academy. And for real wedding inspiration, you can follow our client weddings on Hitched Events Instagram. Thanks so much, and I will see you next week.